This is a picture of Greenwood in North Tulsa, Oklahoma in the 1930s, after the Tulsa Massacre. Yes, when we think of the Tulsa Massacre, we picture a neighborhood in ruins with dilapidated structures, rubble-filled streets, smoky buildings, and a dystopian atmosphere, much like European cities bombed after World War II. While that is a realistic description of Greenwood shortly after the Tulsa Massacre, what many people don't know is that the resilient community was able to pick up the pieces and literally rebuild Greenwood into a thriving, successful Black community. Matter of fact, Greenwood's moniker, the Black Wall Street, is from this period and not before the massacre. In 1926, W.E.B. Du Bois wrote, "5 little years ago, fire and blood and robbery leveled it to the ground. Scars are there, but the city is impudent and noisy. It believes in itself. Thank God for the grit of Black Tulsa." So how did Greenwood go from the mighty Black Wall Street to merely a few dozen Black storefronts if it wasn't for the Tulsa Massacre of 1921? Simple. It was the federally funded interstate highway system. That, coupled with urban renewal, built highways that cut right through North Tulsa's Greenwood neighborhood. The federal funded interstate highway system did what the Klan and the angry racist white mob couldn't do, which was demolish and depopulate the Black residents of the Black Wall Street. And if you think this was solely a Tulsa problem, think again. This newly funded system took place practically in every major city in America. Rondo was a thriving Black neighborhood in St. Paul, destroyed by the construction of I-94 in the mid-1950s. Urban renewal in the US 27 and the Riverfront Parkways cut off and destroyed Black businesses in the Ninth Street neighborhood of Chattanooga, Tennessee. I-10 was built through the Tremaine neighborhood, which uprooted historic oak trees along with hundreds of Black residents and businesses out of the historic Black neighborhoods in New Orleans. And the list goes on and on and on. And what's worse, we continue to solely place blame on Black residents for the state their neighborhoods are in today, when in fact their communities were intentionally chosen to be destroyed in favor of constructing the American interstate highway system. Prior to World War II, streetcars and pedestrian-friendly infrastructure were the norm in American cities. Even sprawling cities such as Houston, Dallas, and Atlanta once had bustling downtowns and vibrant streetscapes. World War II was a turning point in the way American cities were built. The war brought economic expansion that gave more Americans the opportunity to purchase automobiles. Prior to World War II, the idea of owning a car wasn't necessarily a realistic ideal for the average American, and especially for Black Americans. But that slowly started to change once the automobile became more affordable and really exploded with the return of soldiers from the war. In addition, the 1944 Servicemen Readjustment Act, commonly known as the GI Bill, gave returning soldiers low-interest loans and mortgages. The GI Bill gave those returning soldiers the ability to afford homes, but in order to get those loans, houses had to be bought in suburban areas. Coupled with car affordability and mass production, and over time, American cities would take on a dramatically different look and feel from its humble beginnings, pre-World War II. The GI Bill had benefits ranging from decent pay, access to good jobs, and affordable housing that made raising a family possible like never before in America. This was one of the factors that produced the baby boom generation. With the increasing demand for housing, picket fence with a front yard, and the ubiquity of the automobile opened up suburban development. The rise of the American middle class exploded, but not for everyone. Millions of Black soldiers returning from World War II came back to an America that was still suffering from segregation. That segregation meant millions of Black soldiers who fought for this country were excluded from the benefits of the GI Bill. Black soldiers were returning back to communities that were largely created indirectly by the National Housing Act of 1934. The federal government began to be involved in the practice and the concurrent establishment of the Federal Housing Administration. The FHA's formalized redlining process was developed by their chief land economist, Homer Hoyt, as part of an initiative to develop the first underwriting criteria for mortgages. The implementation of this federal policy accelerated the decay and isolation of minority inner-city neighborhoods through withholding of mortgage capital, making it even more difficult for neighborhoods to attract and retain families able to purchase homes. The discriminatory assumptions in redlining exacerbated residential racial segregation and urban decay in the United States. You may know this act by another name, redlining. But before the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956, the American federal government introduced into American cities a discriminating act we now know today as redlining. In 1935, the Federal Home Loan Bank Board asked the Home Owners Loan Corporation to look at 239 cities and create residential security maps to indicate the level of security for real estate investments in each surveyed city. On the maps, the newest areas, those considered desirable for lending purposes, were outlined in green and known as Type A. These were typically affluent suburbs on the outskirts of cities. Type B neighborhoods, outlined in blue, were considered still desirable, whereas older Type C were labeled declining and outlined in yellow. Type D neighborhoods were outlined in red and were considered the most risky for mortgage support. While about 85% of the residents of such neighborhoods were white, they included most of the African American urban households. These neighborhoods tended to be the older districts in the center of cities. Often they were also African American neighborhoods. Urban planning historians theorized that the maps were used by private and public entities for years afterward to deny loans to people in black communities. But recent research has indicated that the HOLC did not redline in its own lending activities and that the racist language reflected the bias of the private sector and experts hired to conduct the appraisals. These policies were in direct correlation with the rising population of blacks into major urban centers throughout America via the Great Migration. The Great Migration was one of the largest movements of people in the United States history. Approximately 6 million black people moved from the American South to northern, midwestern, and western states roughly from the 1910s into the 1970s. Now, that didn't mean some black families didn't prosper during that time in American history, but that the general population of black Americans could never obtain the level of economic wealth that their white counterparts obtained in the same city. Fast forward to the era of the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956, and you will start to see the rapid construction and expansion of the suburb to house the many hundreds of thousands returning white veterans. Encouraged by government subsidy to buy homes, many flocked to the newly built neighborhoods across the West, especially if they were white. If you live in the suburbs today, chances are there are no buildings older than 1950 in your neighborhood, or for miles and miles around. This brought with it an even more racial and economic division in this country. This was exacerbated in the 1970s when a worldwide economic crisis forced the globe to rethink how monetary policy was handled. Most middle-class careers were now found in the suburbs. With the rise of shopping malls and commercial centers, the need for the average American to trek downtown disappeared. This led to a spiraling lack of economic opportunity in urban centers and a concentration of wealth in suburban areas. This also shifted the tax base out of cities, forcing them to slash budgets and programs made much worse by the Reagan budgets of the 1980s. This created a vacuum of urban poverty where those who could afford to leave moved out. Sometimes referred to as white flight to the suburbs, this also fostered additional racial tension and helped discrimination become even more systemic, which doesn't really create core centers in American cities to becoming cultural and economic strongholds that every citizen can equally benefit from. This is one of the reasons why most American cities are generally built worse than most major European cities. Now, it does help that European cities were built much more earlier before the automobile industry than in America. Also, European cities didn't have a large influx of black residents during that same period. Who knows if European cities wouldn't have implemented similar racist systemic policies to curb black prosperity during that same time period. Had state and local officials not bought into the idea that highways would be welcomed as revitalization tools, and had urban renewal not moved forward with demolishing black communities seen as blighted, how would American cities look today? How would Black America look today? Would there be more nuclear families in the black community by now? Would there be less crime in the black community? Would there be less homelessness by now? Would there be less racial tension or even less of a racial wealth gap in American cities? It's easy to shrug these notions off as simply a black problem, but in actuality, these decades of practices further ruined the infrastructure of American cities. While the America of today has acknowledged the mistakes made by the Federal Aid Highway Act and urban renewal, the country still isn't ready to let go of systemic racism at the expense of Black American prosperity. While there is more awareness and conversations being had about America's past systemic racist policies, the country is still finding new and not so subtle ways of displacing black and brown people from urban cores throughout America. Gentrification has once again been another tactic used to displace black communities that could no longer afford to live in places that were in large part destroyed, then neglected by local, state, and federal governments for decades after urban renewal and the Federal Highway Act of 1956. The Great Reversal migration back to the South and the suburbanization of Black America. Black Americans from more expensive cities in the North and West Coasts are turning to more southern metropolitan areas due to the cost of living and economic opportunities. While at the same time, Black Americans are experiencing a suburbanization in most, if not all, major cities in every region in America, including the South. Even a city like Atlanta, which by many is considered a Black Mecca, is losing Black people in the city limits and being replaced by more affluent white millennials. Despite improvements in urban infrastructure in this country, America is still finding new ways to repeat old mistakes. Cities like Houston and Tulsa are still pushing for widening already existing highways that will only continue the displacement of Black and brown communities. At this point in time, I don't think America can be fixed. I don't see a scenario where society embraces Black America as equal counterparts and that Black people collectively can have the same quality of life in the same urban settings as their white counterparts. So, let me hit you to this. If you ever took a trip to Europe or even Asia and thought to yourself, why can't American cities look like London, Paris, or even Amsterdam? Just remember that local, state, and federal governments used a Highway Act, urban renewal, and the growing auto industry to further segregate people in this country. Because keeping races segregated was more important than making pedestrian-friendly, beautiful, scenic cities that every American citizen could enjoy and benefit from. That's my time. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And until next time.